Please welcome Richard Dean Anderson.
In 2013, Hollywood blinked in disbelief. Richard Dean Anderson, MacGyver himself, the unflappable hero who could disarm a bomb with a paperclip, walked away from an estimated $30 million worth of projects. He was only 63. His phone kept ringing. Studio executives begged. Agents pleaded. Fans wrote letters that stacked higher than a director's chair. And still, Anderson disappeared. This wasn't a quiet career fade, the kind that happens when roles dry up. His career was still blazing. Networks floated primetime deals, film producers dangled franchise offers, and convention promoters waved blank checks. But he didn't even glance at them. One day he was a bankable star, the next he was gone. To outsiders, it looked reckless. Why abandon guaranteed millions when you're at the top of your game? Why turn your back on decades of goodwill from an industry that rarely forgives a cold exit? Friends called it a mystery. Hollywood insiders called it suicide. Yet Anderson remained silent, offering only vague hints about wanting something different, never explaining what that something was. Behind that silence lurked a truth few people suspected. Those closest to him whispered about a weight he had carried for years, a shadow that stretched all the way back to his MacGyver days. Something happened on those sets, or in the power corridors surrounding them, that left a scar he never displayed in public. The man who once thrived on risk, who made a career of improvising escapes on screen, had chosen the most dramatic escape of all, vanishing from the spotlight. And so the question lingers like smoke after an explosion. What secret could drive Richard Dean Anderson to turn away from fortune and fame at the height of his career? Those who have known Richard Dean Anderson the longest say the real story isn't about money or fame at all. It's about a silence he's carried like an unhealed fracture, something that reaches back decades to the years when MacGyver ruled television and Anderson's face was plastered on. Billboards from Los Angeles to London. On paper, those were golden years. He was the clever hero who could stop a chemical leak with nothing but a gum wrapper. Ratings soared, fan mail poured in, and producers kept extending contracts. But while audiences saw a charming problem solver, Anderson was privately confronting a different kind of danger, the relentless grind and behind-the-scenes politics that can twist even the strongest spirit. Friends recall late-night phone calls, where his voice carried an exhaustion that wasn't about long days on set. He hinted at betrayals, at moments when the dream job felt more like a trap. He never shared details, only fragments that suggested something happened during those seasons that left a deep, private bruise. "Hollywood can eat you alive," one former crew member said years later. "Some of what we saw back then would break a lot of people." Whatever it was, Anderson made a choice, never to speak of it publicly. Not in interviews, not in memoirs, not even in the informal chats that stars sometimes offer fans. To this day, the specifics remain locked away, known only to a very few. But those who understand the weight of that silence say it explains everything about why he ultimately walked away when the industry begged him to stay. Richard Dean Anderson's story starts far from studio lights and red carpets, in a corner of the world where winters bite hard and the air carries the scent of pine. He was born on a frigid January day in 1950 in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, a tiny Canadian town closer to endless forests than any Hollywood dream. His arrival came with the sharp crackle of winter wind outside the hospital windows, yet his parents, Stuart and Jocelyn Anderson, didn't linger there. When Richard was only 3 days old, they bundled their newborn into a car and crossed the border into the United States, settling in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That city, known for icy lakes and hearty Midwestern grit, became the backdrop for Richard's childhood. The Anderson household was more than just four walls. It was a living studio of music, paint, and performance. His father, Stuart, spent his days teaching English and drama at the local high school, and his nights plucking smooth lines on a jazz bass in dimly lit clubs. His mother, Jocelyn, was an artist through and through, a painter and sculptor whose hands were rarely still. Together, they filled their home with rhythm and color. Jazz standards drifted through the air, mingling with the earthy smell of turpentine and fresh clay. Richard, the eldest of 4 brothers, absorbed it all. He'd sit quietly at the back of school auditoriums while his father rehearsed plays, wide-eyed as actors transformed simple classrooms into entire worlds. One night he watched a rehearsal where actors used Twinkies as a stand-in birthday cake. That small, silly detail stuck in his mind. He decided that any job offering free Twinkies and the magic of pretending might be worth chasing. But art wasn't his only early passion. Life in Roseville, the suburb where the family eventually settled, meant long winters of frozen ponds and pickup hockey games. Richard laced up his first pair of skates almost as soon as he could walk, and the rink became his second home. Neighbors remember him as a boy who'd spend hours practicing slap shots until his cheeks burned, red from the cold, despite modest finances. His father's teacher salary left little room for luxuries. The Andersons nurtured creativity and curiosity. Richard and his brothers learned to stretch every dollar. He took on a paper route to help out, learning the value of hard work before most kids his age even considered it. That combination of artistic exposure and Midwestern toughness shaped him early. He could spend an afternoon lost in his mother's paintbrush strokes, then race outside to carve sharp turns across the ice until the stars appeared. Inside the Anderson home, there was music, laughter, and a sense that the world was bigger than the snowbound streets outside. It was a childhood built on contrasts, discipline and imagination, quiet observation and fearless play. Long before Hollywood scripts entered the picture, these influences gave Richard the restless energy and vivid storytelling instincts that would one day captivate millions. By the time Richard Dean Anderson was old enough to grip a hockey stick with confidence, the frozen ponds around Roseville had become his personal arena. Winter after winter, he carved across the ice with a speed and precision that made neighbors stop and watch. Hockey wasn't just a pastime. It was his heartbeat. What began as casual neighborhood games quickly escalated into serious competition. Coaches noticed his instinct for strategy, the way he anticipated plays before they happened. He skated with a mix of finesse and grit that belied his age. Word spread, and before long, scouts from real teams were keeping an eye on the lanky teen with sharp reflexes and relentless drive. Hockey legend Stan Mikita once witnessed his moves and reportedly praised the young player's raw talent. For Richard, that recognition felt like a door cracking open to a life he could almost taste. He started to dream bigger, picturing himself in professional leagues, the roar of a crowd echoing in his ears. But even as hockey consumed his days, another spark glowed quietly in the background. The world of performance, introduced by his father's school plays, tugged at him in unexpected ways. He loved watching actors transform a plain stage into something alive. Sometimes he'd slip into an empty auditorium just to soak in the smell of sawdust and paint, the soft hum of stage lights. Still, at this stage of life, hockey reigned supreme. He'd wake before dawn to practice, enduring Minnesota's bitter cold without complaint. His bedroom walls were dotted with clippings of famous players, each a reminder of the future he envisioned. Every muscle in his body ached for the sport, and every plan he made revolved around the rink. Richard wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing the sheer thrill of the game, the speed, the sound of blades scraping ice, the moment when the puck slid into the net with a satisfying crack. To his teenage mind, the NHL didn't feel like a dream. It felt inevitable. That single-minded passion defined his identity. Friends called him a hockey nut, and he wore the title proudly. He couldn't imagine a life that didn't include the icy rush of competition. What he didn't know was how quickly that vision would shatter, setting him on a path that would change everything. The future looked carved in ice for Richard Dean Anderson until it cracked beneath him. At 16, in the middle of a fiercely contested game, he chased the puck into a collision that would alter everything. A thunderous hit sent him sprawling. Pain shot through his right arm like fire. The break was clean but brutal, a jagged interruption to the life he'd built around the rink. Doctors set the bone and warned him to rest, but hockey players are wired to push limits. Barely 3 weeks later, still aching but restless, Richard returned to the ice. One more hard check, one unlucky fall, and his left arm snapped. This time, the damage was far worse. The bone split so severely that surgeons had to insert pins and plates, his arm cradled in a heavy cast that felt more like a cage than a bandage. Hospital days stretched into weeks, then months. The sterile smell of antiseptic replaced the familiar scent of cold air and freshly sharpened blades. Doctors spoke in careful tones about the possibility of permanent loss of movement. Scouts who had been circling faded into silence. The dream of professional hockey, so vivid and unstoppable just weeks earlier, dissolved like frost under a sudden thaw. For Richard, the physical pain was only part of the torment. Hockey wasn't a hobby, it was his identity. Without it, he felt unmoored. Friends visited, but the clatter of their skates when they left echoed like a reminder of what he'd lost. He drifted into a quiet depression, unsure of who he was without the game that had defined him. Yet in that enforced stillness, something unexpected began to surface. His father's school productions, once background noise in his life, took on new significance. When Stuart Anderson invited him to watch rehearsals, Richard went, partly out of boredom, partly for company. From the back of the auditorium, he watched actors transform blank stages into whole worlds, their voices filling the empty space with possibility. He began to imagine himself up there, not as a fleeting fantasy, but as a lifeline. Acting required no skating, only presence and imagination. It demanded courage of a different kind. Even with casts on both arms, he joined drama clubs, reading lines, and discovering the thrill of becoming someone else. The boy who once measured his worth in goals and assists felt another fire ignite. What seemed at first like tragedy slowly revealed itself as a turning point. Hockey's loss became the seed of a new dream, one that would carry him far beyond any frozen pond. The quiet months of recovery gave Richard Dean Anderson something he'd never known before: time to listen to himself. The hospital stays, the endless hours with both arms bound in plaster, forced him to sit still and notice what else might live inside him besides hockey. He found it in the dim glow of high school theaters where his father directed plays. Stuart Anderson's productions were modest, painted backdrops, borrowed props, but to Richard they felt electric. He'd slip into the back row, watching how a bare stage transformed when the first line was spoken. The actors weren't just reading words. They were bending reality. That transformation hooked him. When he finally joined a drama club, both arms still healing, he felt a charge he hadn't experienced even on the fastest breakaway down a rink. Performing was risk of another sort. No helmet, no pads, just raw presence. The adrenaline of an audience leaning forward in silence was as real as any crowd's roar. Soon, he was volunteering for every production he could find. He helped build sets, moved lights, and read small parts that grew into larger roles. The applause at curtain call was modest compared to a stadium cheer, yet somehow more intimate, more personal. Acting gave him a sense of motion again, a way to keep chasing challenges when his body said no to hockey. Instead of scoring goals, he learned to chase emotions, fear, wonder, joy, and shape them into stories. He realized that imagination could carry him farther than skates ever would. By the time his arms fully healed, Richard was no longer the boy defined only by hockey. A new path had taken root, one that promised adventure beyond the frozen ponds of Minnesota. The stage had lit a fire that nothing, not even the memory of lost dreams, could extinguish. Richard Dean Anderson's teenage years became a proving ground for boldness. Once hockey was no longer his destiny, he sought challenges that tested his body and spirit in other ways. What emerged was a young man restless for motion, hungry for experiences that carried a charge of danger and discovery. Money at home was always tight. His father's teacher salary stretched to feed and clothe 4 boys, leaving little for luxuries or big trips. But Richard learned early that limited cash didn't have to mean limited adventure. He delivered newspapers at dawn, pedaling through Minnesota snowstorms, pocketing every dime so he could fund his own escapades. At 10, he hatched his first major plan, a solo bicycle ride from Minneapolis to Duluth, roughly 100 miles north. He didn't tell his parents the full distance, just enough to get out the door. With a backpack of snacks and a heart full of determination, he pedaled until the sun dipped low and his small body simply gave out around the halfway mark. He turned back exhausted but exhilarated. Instead of feeling like a failure, he returned home with the quiet pride of someone who had tested his limits and discovered the thrill of pushing beyond comfort. By 17, that taste for risk had only sharpened. The summer before graduation, Richard mounted his bike again, this time for a staggering 5,600-mile odyssey. He traced a path from Minnesota through the vast stretches of Canada all the way to Alaska. The ride took months and demanded near-superhuman endurance. The final 33 days he rode completely alone, no support car, no traveling companions, only a young man versus endless road, shifting weather, and his own fatigue. Earlier that same year, he had already stared down nature's wrath. Caught in a ferocious snowstorm in Taos, New Mexico, he endured 105-mile-per-hour winds and near whiteout conditions. Where others might have panicked, Richard steadied himself and survived, a lesson in calm under pressure that would echo in his future acting roles. Thrill-seeking became a way of life. He learned to scuba dive, plunging into icy waters where visibility was a gamble and every breath mattered. He developed a love for motorcycles and eventually owned 4, including a gleaming Harley-Davidson. Dirt bike crashes left him scraped and bruised, but he would climb back on with a grin. He seemed drawn to moments when the stakes were real. One winter, after hearing about world record attempts in extreme conditions, he built an igloo in the Minnesota cold and decided to live in it. For 3 days, he slept on packed snow, nearly freezing but refusing to give up until he'd proven he could outlast the bitter chill. Even his downtime carried an edge. He'd leap from school rooftops just to feel the rush of air or dive off boards head first, once splitting his scalp and needing stitches. Each stunt, each brush with danger wasn't just about adrenaline. It was about testing boundaries, about refusing to let fear dictate the size of his world. These adventures did more than feed a need for excitement. They forged resilience and quick thinking, qualities that would become trademarks of his on-screen characters. When audiences later watched MacGyver improvise escapes with duct tape and pocket knives, they were seeing reflections of the young man who once biked thousands of miles alone and built an ice shelter for fun. By the time Richard stood on the edge of adulthood, he'd already lived through enough near misses and triumphs to fill a lifetime. He wasn't reckless for the sake of it. He was chasing something deeper, a sense of being fully alive. And though he couldn't yet know it, every wild stunt, every frozen night, every solitary mile was preparing him for the unpredictable path to Hollywood that lay just ahead. By the mid-1970s, Richard Dean Anderson had already collected a lifetime's worth of adventures. But he was restless for something larger. Something that would challenge both his creativity and his nerve. College had never fully captured him. He'd enrolled at Ohio University, dabbled in theater and drama classes, and absorbed what he could about stagecraft. Yet classrooms felt too safe, too structured for a young man wired for motion. So in 1976, he made a decision as daring as any of his solo bike treks. He left school behind and headed for Los Angeles with no guaranteed job. No financial cushion, and only a dream that acting might become more than a pastime. He packed his few belongings, said goodbye to the familiar winters of Minnesota, and aimed his life toward the bright but unforgiving lights of Hollywood. The city greeted him with its usual mix of sun and uncertainty. Los Angeles in the mid-70s was buzzing with opportunity, but also teeming with thousands of hopefuls who arrived every week. Richard knew the odds, but odds had never scared him. He rented a modest apartment and took whatever work would keep the lights on. One of the strangest gigs he landed involved performing with whales at a marine show, a job that required equal parts showmanship and steady nerves. The massive creatures taught him how to stay calm in front of large audiences and how to project confidence even when conditions were unpredictable, skills that would serve him well under studio lights. Before that, he had sharpened his acting instincts in New York City's small theater scene. Those gritty off-Broadway spaces weren't glamorous, but they were crucibles for craft. He worked odd jobs, studied human behavior on the subway, and performed in front of audiences who expected authenticity more than polish. Every small stage, every experimental play, every curtain call became a kind of training ground, honing the reflexes and improvisational courage that would one day define his screen presence. Los Angeles, however, demanded persistence. Casting calls came and went. Some days brought small victories, commercial auditions, bit parts, while others ended with rejection slips and long walks home. Yet Richard approached each day like one of his daring bike rides. Head down, steady pace, no guarantee of a finish line. He understood that success in Hollywood required endurance, and he had plenty of that. Then came the breakthrough. In the spring of 1976, opportunity finally knocked in the form of a daytime drama that was quietly becoming a powerhouse, General Hospital. Producers were expanding the show from 30 to 45 minutes and needed fresh talent to fill new storylines. Richard auditioned for the role of Dr. Jeff Weber, a character with equal parts charm and complexity. His natural charisma, athletic build, and quick wit won the room. He landed the role. What followed was a whirlwind. Daytime television was a demanding beast. 5 episodes a week, relentless shooting schedules, and scripts that changed overnight. But Richard thrived on the challenge. Over the next 5 years, he appeared in 611 episodes, building a devoted fan base and learning the rhythms of camera work, timing, and audience connection. The long hours felt grueling, but after years of self-imposed adventures and endurance tests, he was ready for the grind. Working on General Hospital taught him how to live inside a character for the long haul, to keep performances fresh even after hundreds of scenes. Colleagues remember his good humor on set, his willingness to improvise when a line didn't land, and his quiet focus when the cameras rolled. The role gave him financial stability, but more importantly, it validated his leap of faith. He wasn't just a kid chasing adrenaline anymore. He was a professional actor with a growing reputation. By the time he left the show in 1981, Richard Dean Anderson had transitioned from a thrill-seeking Midwestern adventurer to a seasoned television performer. The small-town boy who once measured his worth by hockey goals and solo bike miles had found a new arena, one with scripts instead of skates, lights instead of ice. His journey from frozen ponds to soap opera stardom proved that the same grit that carried him across Canada could also carry him through Hollywood's maze. Yet even as his star rose, the restless spark inside him never dimmed. The next chapter, action hero, cultural icon, household name, was waiting just beyond the studio gates. And though neither he nor the industry could know it yet, the experiences that forged him, his endurance, his appetite for risk, his instinct for improvisation, would soon converge in a role that would make him a legend. Decades later, when Richard Dean Anderson stepped back from the glitter of Hollywood, the choice puzzled nearly everyone. To outsiders, it seemed impossible to walk away when the spotlight still burned so brightly. Yet for those who knew his journey, the decision fit the man perfectly. From the start, Richard's life had been about testing limits and rewriting expectations. He'd biked thousands of miles alone, endured brutal storms, and built his career from the ground up with little more than nerve and resilience. Fame had never been the goal. Experience had. He valued the feeling of being fully alive, whether on a frozen pond, a lonely highway, or a bustling soundstage, more than applause or bank balances. By 2013, he had lived through decades of scripts, contracts, and long shooting days. Friends say he began to sense that the industry's demands were starting to feel like another kind of cage, a slow repetition that dulled the spark he had always chased. And there were the quieter shadows, the unspoken memories from his MacGyver years, the private moments of tension and betrayal that he never revealed. Whatever those details were, they weighed enough to remind him that stepping away might be the boldest adventure left. So he chose silence over spectacle, privacy over headlines. He didn't stage a farewell tour or sell a tell-all memoir. He simply turned down multi-million-dollar offers and disappeared from center stage, letting the world wonder why. Some call it mystery. Others call it freedom. For Richard Dean Anderson, it was true to form. The same young man who once built an igloo just to see if he could survive the cold understood that life's greatest challenges aren't always about survival. They're about choosing your own path. And in that final, unexpected act of self-direction, he proved that the most daring escape of his career wasn't one MacGyver ever scripted. It was the escape he made for himself, When the camera stopped rolling and the last studio call sheet faded from view, Richard Dean Anderson didn't retreat into stillness. He simply shifted his adventure elsewhere. Instead of red carpets, his days filled with the quiet pleasures he had once postponed, raising his daughter Wiley, exploring the outdoors, and championing causes close to his heart. He settled into a life guided more by the rhythm of nature than by production schedules. Friends recall seeing him kayaking along calm Pacific inlets at sunrise, or hiking remote trails where the only applause came from rustling leaves. The man who once thrived on high-octane sets now found joy in early morning bird calls and the slow arc of a sunset. Richard also became a committed environmental advocate. He lent his voice and presence to organizations focused on ocean conservation and the protection of wildlife habitats. Whether appearing at charity events or quietly supporting behind the scenes, he approached these efforts with the same steady determination that once carried him across thousands of solitary miles on a bicycle. Parenthood added a deeper dimension to his life. Richard often speaks of Wiley as his proudest accomplishment, describing fatherhood as the role that taught him the most about patience, humor, and unconditional love. Those who meet him today find a man content, unhurried, and still curious. Someone who traded the glare of spotlights for the soft brilliance of everyday moments. For a figure who once symbolized daring escapes, perhaps the greatest adventure was discovering that happiness doesn't require a script or an audience. In choosing a quieter life, Richard Dean Anderson proved once again that the boldest path is often the one you draw for yourself.